I was reading the news a few weeks ago and I saw this crazy headline. It said $124 trillion great wealth transfer going to millennials and Gen Z. And my first thought was, that sounds incredible. Then my second thought was, who actually is getting this money? Because $124 trillion divided by every millennial and Gen Z person in America would certainly be life changing. But something felt off about the math. So naturally, I started digging into the research, looking at Federal Reserve data, studies from financial firms, and academic papers. And what I found was way more complicated than the headlines suggest. The Great Wealth Transfer is real, but it's way more complicated than what the media makes it seem to be. And when you actually look at who receives inheritances, how much they get, and when they get it, the picture changes completely. Let me walk you, though, what I found because I think this affects how we should all be thinking about our financial futures. First, let's start with the headline number $124 trillion. That's the most recent estimate from Carrell Associates, which is a major financial research firm. They updated it in 2024 from their previous estimate of $84 trillion. So, why did it go up? Well, home prices rose 39% since 2020, stock market's up 27%, and the researchers realized that baby boomers control even more wealth than was previously estimated. So, as of 2023, boomers hold 51% of household wealth in America. That's $85 trillion. Millennials and Gen Z combined hold 11%, despite being roughly the same population size. So, there's definitely a massive concentration of wealth in older generations that will eventually pass to younger ones. But here's where it gets interesting. Of that $124 trillion, only $105 trillion actually goes to heirs. The other $18 trillion, it goes to charity. And of that $105 trillion going to heirs, the distribution is extremely uneven. The top 1.5% of households in the wealthiest families in America, they're receiving 42% of that money. That's $52 trillion going to 1.5% of families. The bottom 50% of Americans are receiving 2.5%. That's $3.1 trillion split among half the country. So to put that in perspective, if you're in the top 1.5%, you're inheriting an average of $5 million. If you're in the bottom 50%, you're getting maybe 6 to 10K, if you get anything at all. The median inheritance in America, which is the amount where half of people get more and half get less, is $46,000. Not the average, the median. The average is much higher, around $300 to $400,000, but that's because a small number of people inheriting millions naturally pulls the average way up. So the typical inheritance that most people actually receive is 46,000. Don't get me wrong, that's a meaningful amount of money, but it's not the kind of transformational wealth the headlines suggest. Here's something I found really interesting. Survey data shows that there's a big gap between what younger people expect to inherit and what their parents actually plan to leave. So 38% of Gen Z expects to inherit something, but only 22% of their parents say they plan to leave an inheritance. That's a 16-point difference. Same pattern with millennials. 32% expect an inheritance, but only 22% of parents plan to leave one. So, where's this disconnect coming from? I think part of it is the media coverage. When you see headlines about this 124 trillion windfall, it sounds like everyone's going to benefit. But the data shows something very different. Most families won't see much, and the families receiving substantial inheritance tend to already be financially secure. There's data from the University of Pennsylvania that breaks down who actually receives inheritances by income level. Among the top 10% of earners, 17.3% receive an inheritance at some point. Among the bottom 10% of earners, only 0.7% do. Less than 1%. You're about 25 times more likely to inherit money if you're already in a high income tax bracket. Now, I want to be clear about what this means. It doesn't mean the system is rigged or that anyone's doing anything wrong. Parents naturally want to help their kids, and if you've built wealth, it makes sense to pass it down. But from a purely factual standpoint, inheritance tends to flow to people who are already doing relatively well. And that has implications for wealth inequality within younger generations. Think about two people born the same year, similar education, similar jobs, similar salaries. One has parents who own a home and have retirement savings. The other has parents who rent and lives paycheck to paycheck. 30 years later, the first might inherit 300 to $400,000. The second person inherits nothing. That creates a lifetime wealth gap of potentially $1 to $2 million between two people who worked equally hard and made similar choices. The difference is just what family they were born into. But let's say you're someone who will inherit something substantial. Your parents own a home, have some savings, and you're expecting to receive maybe $200 to $300,000 when they pass. That seems like it would be helpful for retirement or maybe help you buy a house if you haven't already. Here's where healthcare cost becomes a major factor. And this is probably the most important part of the whole discussion that doesn't get talked about enough. The average cost of a nursing home in 2024 is $111,000 per year for a semi-private room, $128,000 for a private room. Assisted living facilities run about $71,000 per year. If someone wants to stay in their own home with a health aid, that's about $70,000 per year. And here's what surprised me when I was researching this. Medicare doesn't cover long-term nursing home care. I think a lot of people assume it does. Medicare covers hospital stays and some short term rehabilitation, but it does not cover extended nursing home stays or assisted living. Those costs are paid out of pocket until someone's assets are depleted, and then Medicaid kicks in. Research from the Urban Institute found that 43% of baby boomers will require some form of paid long term care before they pass away, almost half. And for those who need it, the average lifetime cost is $240,000. Let me walk through a scenario for you. Someone's parent is 78, been living independently, but has a fall and needs assistance going forward. They move into assisted living at $71,000 per year. They lived there for 6 years. That's $426,000 in care costs. If that parent had $500,000 in total assets, including home equity and savings, after 6 years of care, there's about $74,000 left. Split between three adult children, that's about $25,000 each. Don't do it. Now, $25,000 is still meaningful money. I don't want to minimize that, but it's very different from the $166,000 per child that would have been inherited without the long-term care costs. Healthcare expenses reduce the inheritance by about 85%, and this pattern shows up in the data. New research from 2025 found that 16% of people who enter nursing homes without Medicaid end up depleting all their assets and going on Medicaid during their stay. Another 34% were already on Medicaid when they arrived because they've already spent down their savings. That's 50% of nursing home residents on Medicaid, meaning they've exhausted their private funds. The median savings for older Americans is $36,000. 1 year in a nursing home is $111,000. For middle class families, extended care can consume most of all, if not all the assets that would have been inherited, right? So the wealthiest families, those with several $1 million, they can absorb these costs and still leave a good inheritance. But for middle class families with 200 to $500,000 in total assets, healthcare costs take a significant portion and sometimes all of it. Now let's say healthcare costs are manageable and there's still assets to inherit. Here's the next challenging that doesn't get discussed much, which is timing. The average age when someone receives an inheritance, let's say $100,000 or more, is 46 years old. For smaller inheritance, it tends to be even later, often in the 50s or early 60s. Think about when someone typically needs financial help. Usually, it's in your late 20s and 30s. That's when you're trying to save for a down payment on a home, when you're starting a family and dealing with childcare costs. It's also when you might want to start a business or make a career change. That's when an influx of capital would have made the biggest impact on your long term trajectory. Also, when you might want to start a business or make a career change. That's when an influx of capital would have made a long term impact on your career, right? But most people don't inherit until they're in their peak earning years, when their children are grown, when they're already 10 to 15 years from retirement. At that point, the money is valuable as retirement supplement, but it doesn't provide the same leverage it would have provided 20 years prior. For millennials specifically, most of their parents are baby boomers who are currently 60 to 78 years old. With average life expectancy in the mid 80s, many millennials are looking at another 10 to 25 years before they inherit. By that time, most millennials will be in their 50s and 60s themselves. For Gen Z, the timing is even more delayed. Most Gen Z's parents are Gen X, currently 44 to 59. Gen Z won't typically inherit until they're in their 60s and 70s. So the timing mismatch means that inheritance often arrives after the key wealth building years have passed. It helps with retirement, but it doesn't help you buy a house at 30 or start a business at 35. Let me give you two hypothetical situations to illustrate this. Two people, same age, same education, same career path, same salary. Person A has grandparents who pass away when they're 26 and leave them $80,000. Person A uses that as a down payment on a house. Over the next 25 years, the house appreciates and they build equity. Person B's parents are healthy and likely to live another 25 years. Person B spends their 20s and 30s renting because they can't save enough for a down payment. They finally buy a house at 40. By the time both people are 50, person A has built substantially more wealth, not because they worked harder or they were even smarter, but simply just because they received money at 26 instead of 56. That timing difference compounds over decades and can result in a $400,000 to $500,000 difference in net worth by retirement age. Now let's talk about what you're actually inheriting because it's not always cash. It's often illiquid assets that come with their own complications. So, about 42% of the wealth being transferred consists of illiquid assets. That means real estate, family businesses, retirement accounts with distribution rules, and and sometimes it could be collectibles or art. Things you can't immediately spend, things you have to sell first. And some of them comes with challenges. Let's say the main asset is a family home worth $450,000. Three siblings inherit it. One wants to keep it for sentimental reasons. One wants to sell it immediately and take the cash. A third is somewhere in the middle. That's a common situation and it often leads to tension. Eventually, the decision is made to sell, but if the housing market happens to be soft when you need to sell, you might have to list below the appraised value. After realtor fees and closing costs, a $450,000 house might net 390. Split three ways, that's 130 grand each instead of the 150 grand you would have gotten in full value. Or consider a family business. Only about 30% of family businesses successfully transition to the second generation. Only 10 to 15% make to the third generation. Why is this? Sometimes the children don't want to run the business, right? Sometimes there are disagreements about how to run it. Sometimes there's no clear succession plan. The result is often that the businesses get sold for less than its potential value, or it simply closes. Then there are retirement accounts like IRAs and 401ks, and there's a rule called the Secure Act from 2019 that changed how inherited retirement accounts work. If you inherited one from a non spouse, you have to fully withdraw all the money within 10 years, and every dollar you withdraw gets taxed as ordinary income. So if you inherited a $500,000 IRA, you could take nothing for 9 years and then withdraw it all in year 10. But that $500,000 gets added to your income that year. If you're working and making $80,000, suddenly you have $580,000 in taxable income. You're in the highest tax bracket. You could easily lose $185,000 to federal and state income tax. Or you could spread it out over 10 years, taking $50,000 annually. That still adds $50,000 to your income each year, pushing you into a higher tax bracket. Either way, you're losing 30 to 40% of the inherited retirement account to taxes because the government wants it. Comparing that to inheriting stocks or real estate, those assets get what's called a step up in basis. So if your parents bought a house for $100,000 in 1980 and it's worth $500,000 today, when they pass, you inherited the $500,000 basis. So if you sell immediately, you pay zero capital gains tax on that appreciation. That's a huge tax advantage many people don't realize. but retirement accounts don't get the same treatment, unfortunately. So, depending on what type of assets are being inherited, the actual after tax value can vary significantly. Here's what all this adds up to, and why I think the narrative around the great wealth transfer needs to be more accurate. This is a real phenomenon. $124 trillion dollars is moving from older to younger generations over the next 25 years. That's a fact. But the way it's often presented, it sounds like it's going to broadly help millennials and Gen Z catch up economically, and the data just doesn't support that interpretation. The wealth transfer is extremely concentrated at the top. Most people will inherit modest amounts or nothing at all. Those who do inherit substantial amounts tend to already be in better financial positions. The money arrives late, usually in your 50s and 60s, rather than when you're young and could use it most effectively. Healthcare costs consume a significant portion of middle class estates. The assets themselves often come with complications that reduce their effective value. Research from Sweden, which has excellent data on this, found something interesting. When people first receive inheritances, it temporarily reduces wealth inequality because receiving $100,000 means more to someone with little wealth than it does with someone who's already wealthy. But with about 10 years, that equalizing effect completely reverses. So, why? Because wealthier people tend to invest inherited money and let it compound. People with less wealth tend to use it for immediate needs. Over time, the inheritance actually increases inequality rather than reducing it. And I want to be clear, using inheritance for immediate needs isn't irresponsible. If you've been struggling and you finally get $50,000, using it to pay off debt or cover unnecessary expenses, or rather necessary expenses, is completely rational, but it means the inheritance doesn't build wealth. It provides relief, which is valuable, but it doesn't change your long term goals, right? So, about 11% of US households have zero or negative net worth. That's roughly 14 million households with nothing to pass down. Their children will inherit nothing, some will inherit debt obligations. And you have student loans, adding another layer. The average millennial has $40,000 in student debt. The average for Gen Z is 23,000. When you can inherit 60,000, but you're carrying 40,000 in student loans, your effective inheritance is $20,000. Many people use inheritance primarily to eliminate debt, which brings them back to zero rather than moving them ahead. There's also what's called the sandwich generation. 23% of American adults are currently providing financial support to both their aging parents and their own children at the same time. The average annual cost of that support is $10,000. About 51% report sacrificing their own financial security to provide that support. So you're in your 40s or 50s helping your parents financially and helping your kids at the same time while you're trying to save for retirement. So naturally, something has to give, and usually it's your own retirement savings. Then, when your parents eventually pass, if there's anything left after their healthcare costs, you inherit it. But you've already spent years depleting your own savings to help them. The inheritance doesn't make you whole, it partially compensates for what you already gave up. So here's my conclusion after looking at all this data. The Great Wealth Transfer is real, but it's not a solution to the economic challenges us younger generations are facing. It's not going to broadly help millennials and Gen Z afford homes or start businesses or retire comfortably. What's actually doing is transferring wealth from affluent older families to their children, who tend to already be doing relatively well. Everyone else receives modest amounts that arrive too late, too significantly after their financial careers. So I'm not presenting this to be pessimistic. I'm presenting it because I think accurate information is important for planning. If you're 28 years old right now and thinking, I'll just wait for my inheritance to buy a house, that's probably not a realistic plan. Your inheritance, if you receive one, is likely coming when you're in your 50s. It's not going to help you with a down payment now. You need a different approach. You need to build wealth through savings, investing, career advancement, because inheritance isn't coming in time to help with major financial decisions of your 20s, 30s, and 40s. But I also think we need to be realistic about what this wealth transfer represents. It's the largest intergenerational transfer in history. It's huge, but it's primarily benefiting those who need it least and arriving too late for those who need it most. That's also true. And for those who are thinking about their own estate planning, this research has implications too. If you want your money to make a real difference in your children's lives, waiting until you pass away means they'll receive it when they're older and less able to leverage it. So, helping earlier when they're buying their first home or starting a family has a much larger impact. Now, obviously, that's a personal decision that depends on your own financial security, but the timing matters more than we usually acknowledge. So, if this breakdown was helpful, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe. I'm planning to keep analyzing these economic topics that affect regular people, especially the younger generations, using actual headlines and data because it is pretty big stuff. So, next week, I'm looking at whether buying a house even makes sense anymore given where interest rates and prices are. So, comment down below what you think of this. And that's going to be it for this one. And thanks for watching.